Gunfire shatters the quiet, followed by piercing screams as a shadowed figure bolts from the residence. On this particular street, children usually dominate the landscape. It is a place where conflict typically feels entirely foreign. This is Amamira Harper. At 28, her existence revolved around her 3 children and the modest safety of her home. She lived in a world of perceived security until her closest confidant transformed her reality into a waking horror. Her spouse, Zaki Barnes, had successfully lobbied for a relocation to South Philadelphia, pitching it as their ultimate clean slate. That transition, however, served as the prologue to an unthinkable tragedy. Their first night there descended into absolute chaos. During that initially tranquil Saturday evening within their unfamiliar surroundings, the atmosphere shifted toward the macabre. The woman who served as the family's emotional anchor suddenly faced a lethal betrayal from the man she loved. In late October 2025, local authorities responded to a scene where domestic peace had been violently extinguished. Responders discovered Amamira in the kitchen. She had been struck by 11 bullets while her offspring bore witness. Most chillingly, Zaki, her partner of merely 5 months, held their nursing infant while discharging his weapon at her. The brutality of the tableau was beyond human comprehension. The toddlers, lacking the maturity to process such violence, were forced to watch their mother's life being extinguished. Their supposed guardian became their greatest threat, inflicting psychological scars that time could never hope to erase. What was intended as a fresh chapter became a grim testament to the fragility of trust and the darkness of betrayal. Before examining the finality of that moment, we must trace the path that led to this domestic collapse. Often, the most unremarkable facades serve as the most effective veils for the most sinister of realities. Bystanders rushed to shield the youngsters, desperate to spare them any further exposure to the unfolding carnage. 28-year-old Amamira Harper was defined by her devotion to her 3 small children and her community. She projected a sense of stability. Neighbors, like Latifah Holloway, remembered her as a consistently engaging and compassionate presence. Living just 2 doors away, Holloway viewed her as a dependable ally, someone who genuinely cared for her peers. To the casual observer, the Harper household appeared to be just another young family finding their footing. They seemed focused on establishing roots in South Philly, yet a lethal tension was secretly mounting within those walls. Those close to Amamira recalled her infectious laugh and the vibrant energy she poured into her domestic life. She navigated the complexities of raising children while simultaneously striving to construct a viable future for her family. She was the rare neighbor who truly observed others, offering genuine kindness even amidst the chaos of her schedule. Her impact was subtle yet profound, distinguishing her in a community where many residents remained largely anonymous. The family, known interchangeably as the Harpers or the Harper Barnes unit, were relatively fresh faces on Latona Street. Their tenure on the block had been brief, marking them as newcomers to the tight-knit South Philadelphia enclave. Despite her short residency, Amamira left a mark, possessing a natural talent for transforming neighbors into legitimate friends. Another local resident, Anthony Carden, provided further insight into the family's seemingly unremarkable and polite public persona. He characterized them as exceptionally neighborly, noting their visible attentiveness toward their children and their courteous demeanor. Carden often observed Amamira escorting her children to school, actively integrating herself and her offspring into the local fabric. Her commitment to her maternal role was unmistakable, and her compassionate nature frequently extended beyond her own doorstep. There were 0 red flags, nothing to suggest that an explosion of violence was imminent that October evening. Externally, the couple seemed to be successfully acclimating to the unique cadence of life in South Philadelphia. However, beneath that polished exterior, psychological pressures were reaching a boiling point, obscured until the final lethal eruption. Zaki Barnes, also 28, had been married to Amamira for only 5 months. Their new home represented their collective aspirations. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place dedicated to nurturing their children and fostering a long-term partnership. Amamira remained tragically unaware that this supposed sanctuary would become a crime scene at the hands of her husband. The light Amamira brought to her surroundings stood in stark opposition to the shadow of violence quietly encroaching. Nobody could have predicted such a catastrophic conclusion. On July 19, 2025, the peace evaporated into terror. That particular Saturday evening began with an eerie stillness that would soon be permanently shattered. Nearby residents later described a rapid escalation. heated shouting, followed by gunfire, and then the sound of absolute despair. While the children occupied themselves in the living room, a fatal confrontation was taking place in the kitchen. Zaki reportedly balanced a 1-year-old infant in his arms at the precise moment he produced the firearm. The psychological weight of a father aiming a lethal weapon at his wife while clutching his own flesh and blood is nearly impossible to quantify. In that singular heartbeat, the sanctuary of their domestic life was irrevocably destroyed. 11 rounds tore through the evening quiet, the reports echoing off the Harper residence and spilling into the surrounding neighborhood. That hail of bullets took Amamira's life, leaving her children to carry the permanent mental scars of her final moments. The victim perished in her own kitchen, a domestic space that should have been her ultimate place of safety. Her life had been defined by the quiet rhythms of motherhood, cooking, managing the household, and nurturing her young family. It was in that very heart of the home that her supposed protector became her predator. The act was swift, cold, and utterly senseless. Nearby, residents who had been enjoying the evening on their porches were suddenly pulled into a nightmare. Latifah Holloway grasped the gravity of the situation almost immediately. She moved instinctively to shield the children from the carnage, but the damage was done. They had witnessed everything. Those young eyes saw their mother's life extinguished, their ears ringing with the deafening thunder of 11 gunshots. The air in the home was thick with the terror of screams that would haunt those hallways forever. The man who was supposed to represent security had transformed into the primary threat they needed to flee. Childhood innocence was stripped away in seconds, replaced by a trauma that no child should ever have to process. Anthony Carden watched the frantic escape. The sight of the fleeing children burned into his memory. Even the quiet corridors of South Philly were forced to confront the brutal reality of domestic homicide. The silence following the act was heavy. Tonight, a community gathers to mourn a mother taken far too soon. She was executed in her home within sight of a toddler, with police identifying her husband as the shooter. Family members and neighbors are now left to navigate a devastating new reality. Reporter Brianna Smith is on the scene at Philadelphia Police Headquarters with the latest developments on this tragedy. Neighbors informed Brianna that the family was relatively new to the block and had appeared perfectly ordinary. The sudden explosion of violence left the entire community in a state of profound shock. The focus remains on the children present during the assault, a situation many describe as a heartbreaking tragedy. Latifah Holloway is among many trying to make sense of the violent passing of 28-year-old Amamira Harper. The emotional toll on those who knew her is overwhelming. She was regarded as a daughter by local residents, and her children were constant playmates for the neighborhood's youth. Authorities allege that Zaki Barnes, 28, murdered his wife on Saturday night. The confrontation occurred in the kitchen of their home on the 2600 block of Latona Street, where Barnes reportedly fired 11 times. He held an infant during the shooting, while his other children were just rooms away in the living area. Though they weren't close, neighbors described the family as pleasant and dedicated to their kids. The most painful aspect of the crime is the permanent psychological impact on the surviving children. Anthony Carden didn't hear the initial gunfire but witnessed the frantic aftermath. The image of the family running for their lives is one he says he will never forget. Neighbors scrambled to collect the children, while investigators eventually located Barnes hiding in a nearby backyard. Grieving loved ones clung to each other on the sidewalk as the crime scene was processed. The trauma has rippled through the block, leaving residents leaning on prayer and community strength. As the family requests privacy, the neighborhood's thoughts remain fixed on the welfare of the children. Barnes now faces charges of reckless endangerment and several other serious offenses. Reporting live from Philadelphia Police Headquarters, this is Brianna Smith. The anchor acknowledged the grim update as the investigation moved forward. Officers arrived at the 2600 block of Latona Street to find a scene of absolute chaos. They were met by fleeing children, traumatized neighbors, and the grim remnants of a violent struggle. Investigators documented the evidence of the execution. Amamira Harper had been shot 11 times in her kitchen. As the scene was secured, the community was left with one lingering question: why? The question remained: where was Zaki Barnes? A deeper mystery lingered over how such a tragedy could unfold in a residence teeming with innocent children. Authorities initiated a relentless manhunt. Within minutes, they discovered Barnes crouching in the shadows of a neighboring backyard. While the apprehension was immediate, the neighborhood remained paralyzed by the horror. For those living nearby, the reality of the situation was impossible to process. A household once defined by apparent stability and devotion had been obliterated by a single, inexplicable eruption of violence. The chasm between their public persona and this private nightmare forced witnesses to wonder what warning signs had gone unnoticed. Amamira Harper is described as a woman whose legacy will be defined by her role as a devoted protector of her children. Relatives confirmed that her spouse of merely 5 months was taken into custody in connection with her demise. Reports indicate the children were present when the peace of a typical Saturday evening at 9 o'clock was shattered on a South Philadelphia street. Gunfire pierced the silence, followed by a chorus of screams and the sight of a man fleeing the residence in a blind panic. On this specific block, the presence of youth was the primary characteristic of daily life. It was a place where public conflict and verbal disputes were virtually non-existent. Security footage captured the rapid response. Law enforcement arrived in 90 seconds to transport the victim to emergency medical care. Nearby resident Latifah Holloway watched in horror as her friend, 28-year-old Amamira Harper, fought for her life. Investigators identified the fleeing suspect as 28-year-old Zaki Barnes, now facing murder charges for a crime his own children were forced to witness. The sense of loss is agonizing. Grief has hollowed out the community because she was a person of genuine kindness. She had formed a profound and lasting bond with my own daughter. Philadelphia police report 27 domestic homicides this year, a 10-case increase from the previous period, signaling a lethal trend. Domestic abuse is a tangible threat. Victims must find a lifeline and seek outside intervention immediately. One must escape while the window of opportunity exists, because these cycles of violence claim lives every single day. Grieving relatives describe Amamira as a stellar mother to 3 young souls as they struggle to comprehend the magnitude of their loss. The couple had wed in May and shared a home with their children, with no outward indications of previous physical strife. Currently, Zaki Barnes stands at the center of a serious criminal prosecution. The victim's family gathered near the police station, their focus shifting toward the grim necessity of funeral preparations. Following his capture, Barnes was hit with a litany of charges, including first-degree murder and reckless endangerment. The prosecution characterized the body of evidence against him as overwhelming and undeniable. Witnesses saw the children scramble for safety, while forensic analysis of the bullet paths corroborated the sequence of the assault. The presence of the youth during the gunfire highlighted the sheer depravity and negligence of the shooter's actions. As the handcuffs clicked shut, investigators turned their attention to the volatile moments that preceded the fatal encounter. Those nearby recalled the sounds of a domestic dispute spiraling out of control before the shots rang out. What began as a heated exchange rapidly evolved into a homicide, illustrating the lethal volatility of domestic friction. Initially oblivious in the living area, the children were suddenly thrust into a traumatic reality when the shooting commenced. The fact that he held a 1-year-old infant while discharging the weapon served as a haunting testament to his recklessness. Crime scene technicians scoured every inch of the property with clinical and meticulous precision. Shell casings and forensic data were gathered alongside statements from those who watched the horror unfold. These testimonies provided the essential framework needed to reconstruct the timeline of this atrocity. Detectives mapped the bullet trajectories and the positions of the children, documenting Zaki's desperate attempt to vanish into the night. For the young witnesses, the psychological damage was instantaneous and would likely prove permanent. The children were placed into the care of social services and extended family members to provide a semblance of security. Clinical specialists were engaged to mitigate the long-term psychological fallout of the massacre. Even so, the scars will run deep as the wheels of the justice system began their slow, deliberate grind. Prosecutors emphasized the suspect's history and his access to weaponry as key factors in the upcoming trial. The specific circumstances of the killing necessitated a rigorous and unyielding legal response. Every detail, from the initial arrest to the documentation of the children's suffering, was vital to securing justice for Amamira Harper. The apprehension was merely the opening act of a lengthy process involving litigation and the permanent protection of the survivors. Law enforcement officials underscored the extreme gravity and weight of the situation. The cold, calculated nature of the offense, coupled with its blatant disregard for life, would define the state's aggressive prosecution strategy. Those living nearby began to piece together their fractured memories of the woman they once knew. Latifah Holloway recounted Amamira's inherent grace and maternal devotion, mourning a life extinguished by such a visceral display of force. These testimonies painted a chilling portrait of how domestic volatility can rapidly escalate, leaving a permanent scar on the local community. The couple were relative strangers to the block, having only recently moved into the neighborhood. Despite their brief residency, Amamira's presence was felt. She was the type of mother who commanded a natural, quiet respect. Neighbors often observed her moving with a composed and silent resilience through her daily routines. She balanced the weight of 3 children with a genuine warmth, leaving a lasting mark on Lutana Street in just a few months. Her legacy lived in small moments, a fleeting smile on the sidewalk or a supportive word shared with a fellow parent. For many, Amamira represented a rare glimmer of light within the gritty, rhythmic pulse of South Philadelphia life. She was a dedicated protector, constantly seen escorting her children to school or supervising their play in the afternoon sun. Her innate kindness made the newcomers feel like old friends, as if they had been part of the street's history all along. This sudden integration is precisely why the subsequent violence felt like such a profound betrayal to the neighborhood. The loss was more than a neighbor. It was the disappearance of a woman who had already begun to define the area's soul. While investigators processed the scene, the case highlighted a grim surge in domestic violence, demanding urgent systemic intervention and public awareness. Police records indicated 27 domestic homicides that year, a staggering increase of 10 over the previous 12-month period. Amamira Harper was officially cataloged as another entry in these rising, tragic statistics. Yet she was far more than a file number. She was the emotional anchor for a family and a cherished community member. Her passing emphasized the heavy human toll behind the data, stressing the critical need for proactive measures in domestic disputes. The case became a haunting catalyst for discussions regarding victim safety and the necessity of early protective intervention. Forensically, the evidence was insurmountable, and the district attorney's office prepared to pursue the case with absolute clinical precision. The facts were damning. He had discharged his weapon 11 times into his wife, while their children stood just feet away. The sheer brutality of the scene left no room for legal ambiguity or doubt regarding the perpetrator's intent. The family withdrew into a necessary silence to mourn, a move that surprised no one given the magnitude of their trauma. They grieved for a daughter and sister whose very existence had been the steady heartbeat of her children's world. While arranging a funeral, the relatives faced the impossible task of explaining to 3 toddlers why their father was gone forever. The psychological burden was crushing. The man who should have been their primary guardian had become their primary source of terror. Now, 3 young lives must navigate a future permanently stripped of their mother's guidance and affection. They are the unwilling keepers of memories no child should hold the sights and sounds of that final, fatal domestic explosion. Most chillingly, 1 child was being held as the shots were fired. All this after a mere 5 months of marriage. Perhaps there were whispered warnings or hopes for a change, but those secrets are now buried with the victim. By the time the echoes of the gunfire stopped, the damage was absolute, leaving only a hollow silence where a life once was. The children now wake to a world irrevocably altered, their sense of safety fractured by the haunting memory of that night. Though family members offer what comfort they can, the long shadow of that trauma remains an unyielding presence in their lives. A home, once defined by warmth, is now remembered as a crime scene where the concept of sanctuary was violently erased. The surviving children now require a lifetime of specialized psychological support to process the horror they endured. Meanwhile, the neighborhood struggles to reconcile the extreme violence that shattered the peace of their once quiet residential street. Amamira Harper was not just a data point in Philadelphia's homicide report. She was a vibrant mother and a pillar of her family. The words of those left behind capture a raw, agonizing heartbreak that words can barely begin to describe. Friends remember her as a genuinely kind soul, a woman whose life was a testament to the reality of hidden domestic dangers. Her story serves as a desperate plea for others to seek help and escape before the cycle of control becomes terminal. This tragedy is a stark warning that a facade of domestic normalcy can often hide a brewing, lethal storm. New beginnings can be violently cut short, leaving the most innocent witnesses to bear a burden that will last a lifetime. These children are left to navigate a path forever changed by a single night of inexplicable, premeditated rage. A 5-month union and an ordinary household were dismantled in minutes, leaving a family to struggle with a future of unanswered questions. They were left to mend, forever haunted by the violence that stained their kitchen floor. Inner circles and local residents struggled to process the horrific immediate fallout. Disbelief and the heavy weight of orphaned children remained. A mother's light had vanished. In a place meant for safety, young witnesses now carry a trauma no child should know. Mourners gathered in silence to observe the final rites for Amamira Harper. The atmosphere was stifling with grief for the 3 children whose protector was gone. The service remembered her as a devoted parent whose life centered on her family. Her local legacy was honored, yet the brutal nature of her end cast a long shadow. While kin mourned, the state began its pursuit to hold Zaki Barnes fully responsible. Zaki remains in custody, awaiting his trial. Clinical experts and state advocates arrived to navigate the children through the psychological wreckage. Healing now depends on intensive therapy and a new, rigid sense of routine. New local movements formed, teaching others how to identify the silent precursors of domestic rage. This tragedy highlighted the desperate need for neighbors to speak up before it is too late. Philadelphia was reminded that lethal violence often hides behind a mask of normalcy. It lurks in the quiet moments, behind closed doors, and within familiar faces. The name Amamira Harper now stands as a somber warning for the entire community. Her death revealed how fragile peace is when red flags are left unaddressed. Her offspring remain as living testaments to her love and the cost of unchecked aggression. Authorities in Philadelphia continue to urge the public toward constant vigilance and engagement. They cautioned that this loss is not an anomaly, but a symptom of a broader crisis. It is a systemic battle against domestic terror that requires a collective, watchful eye. For the survivors and those on Leona Street, that Saturday night changed everything forever. The neighborhood carries those dark lessons forward, etched into their shared memory. Rest in peace, Amamira Harper. Your story has evolved into a call for action. It serves as a grim reminder to confront the shadows within our own communities. We invite your thoughts on this case below. If this report was impactful, please engage. Subscribe to our channel to follow our ongoing investigations into these dark realities. The story of Amamira Harper is not just a tragic headline. It is a profound, heart-wrenching reminder that the most lethal storms often brew behind a facade of perfect calm. In just 5 months, a sanctuary was dismantled and a mother's light was extinguished, leaving 3 innocent souls to navigate a world fractured by a betrayal they were never meant to witness. This tragedy teaches us that peace is fragile when red flags go unaddressed. Domestic violence does not always announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it hideously disguises itself in the quiet rhythms of an ordinary life. We must learn to look closer, to listen to the whispers of unease, and to realize that minding our own business can sometimes carry a fatal price. Love should be a shield, never a weapon. We owe it to the survivors, the children who now carry the weight of the unthinkable, to transform our grief into a relentless commitment to vigilance. If you see a shadow where there should be light, or hear a tremor of fear behind a neighbor's smile, speak up. Your courage could be the lifeline that prevents a new beginning from becoming a final chapter. Let Amamira's legacy be our call to action, to protect the vulnerable, to break the cycles of silence, and to ensure that no home ever becomes a crime scene again.